The champagne glass trembled in my hand as my father's voice cut through the elegant chatter of the wedding reception like a knife through silk. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying that familiar tone of authority that had dominated my childhood. "I'd like you all to meet my son Michael, the family's disappointment. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss." Silence fell over the beautifully decorated ballroom. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across faces that had turned toward me with a mixture of curiosity and pity. My brother Derek's wedding reception, which had been flowing with laughter and celebration just moments before, now felt like a courthouse where I was the defendant facing judgment. "Dad, please," Derek whispered urgently, his face flushed with embarrassment as his new bride Sarah gripped his arm, her eyes wide with shock. But Dad was just getting started. At 62, Richard Thompson still commanded attention wherever he went. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit immaculate, and his presence filled the room like he owned it, which, in many ways, he did. As the founder of Thompson & Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious law firms, he was used to having the final word. "No, Derek. It's time everyone knew the truth," Dad continued, his steel-gray eyes fixed on me with the same disappointment I'd seen countless times before. "While you've built something meaningful with your life, become a successful attorney, found a wonderful wife." He gestured toward Sarah, who looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. "Your brother here has spent the last 8 years doing God knows what, probably bouncing from one dead-end job to another." The words hit me like physical blows. I stood there in my off-the-rack suit, feeling every bit the outsider I'd always been in this family. The guests, Derek's law school friends, colleagues, from his firm family friends who had watched our family's drama unfold over the years, stared at me with expressions ranging from sympathy to barely concealed satisfaction at witnessing such a spectacle. "Richard, that's enough." My mother Linda finally found her voice, stepping forward with tears in her eyes. She looked elegant in her mother-of-the-groom dress, but her face was etched with the same pain I felt. "This is Derek and Sarah's day." "Exactly," Dad shot back, his voice rising. "And I won't have it ruined by his presence. Everyone here has worked hard for their success. They've earned their place in this room. But Michael?" He turned back to me, his expression filled with disgust. "What have you accomplished, son? What have you built? What can you point to and say, 'I did that'?" I felt my hands clenched into fists at my sides. Part of me wanted to walk out right then, to spare myself further humiliation. But another part, the part that had been growing stronger over the past 8 years, refused to back down. "You want to know what I've built?" I asked quietly, my voice steady despite the rage boiling inside me. "Please enlighten us," Dad said with a bitter laugh. "Tell us all about your great achievements." Before I could respond, a commotion near the entrance caught everyone's attention. The wedding coordinator, a frazzled-looking woman in her 30s, was rushing toward our group with panic written across her face. Excuse me," she said breathlessly, addressing Derek and Sarah. "I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we have a serious problem. The catering company just called. There's been a mix-up with the dinner service. Half the entrees are missing, and the kitchen staff is completely overwhelmed." Sarah's face went white. "What do you mean missing?" "There was a communication error between the venue and the caterers," the coordinator explained, wringing her hands. "They prepared for 200 guests instead of 300. We're short on the main course, and the dinner service is scheduled to begin in 45 minutes. "This is a disaster," Derek muttered, running his hand through his hair. "Sarah's parents flew in from Seattle. My law firm partners are here. We can't just tell people there's no food." "Can't we order more?" Sarah asked desperately. The coordinator shook her head. "On a Saturday evening? The caterers are already scrambling, but they're saying it could take hours to prepare additional meals. And that's if they can even get the ingredients. I watched, as the color drained from Derek's face. This was supposed to be the perfect day. He'd been planning it for months, sparing no expense. Sarah looked like she might cry, and my mother was already reaching for her phone, probably to call her contacts in the catering business. But it was my father's reaction that surprised me most. For the first time in years, Richard Thompson looked uncertain. The man who always had a solution, who could fix any problem with money or connections, stood there looking helpless. "There has to be something we can do," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. That's when Sarah's father, Robert Sterling, stepped forward. He was a distinguished man in his late 50s, with graying temples and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. I'd been introduced to him briefly during the pre-wedding festivities, but we hadn't had much chance to talk. "If I may," Robert said calmly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone used to solving problems. "I might have a solution, but I'll need to make a few phone calls." "Anything?" Derek said immediately. "Whatever you can do." Robert nodded and stepped away from the group, pulling out his phone. I watched him dial a number, his expression focused and determined. There was something familiar about the way he carried himself, something that reminded me of Michael Sterling speaking. I heard him say into the phone, and my heart nearly stopped. "Yes, I need to speak with the operations manager immediately. We have a situation that requires immediate attention." The surname hit me like a lightning bolt. Sterling, Robert Sterling. My mind raced as pieces fell into place. The authoritative bearing, the confidence when handling a crisis, the way he naturally took charge of the situation. Robert Sterling, CEO of Sterling Industries, one of the largest hospitality and event management companies on the West Coast. The same Robert Sterling whose company had acquired my regional firm 3 years ago. The same Robert Sterling who was, technically speaking, my boss's boss's boss. And he had no idea who I was. I stood frozen, watching as the man I'd seen only in corporate videos and annual reports worked his phone, trying to save his daughter's wedding reception. The irony was almost too much to bear. Here was my father, publicly humiliating me in front of everyone, calling me a failure, while the CEO of my company, a man whose decisions affected thousands of employees across dozens of states, stood just a few feet away. "Dad," I said quietly, but he was too busy trying to salvage the situation to listen. "Not now, Michael," he snapped. "Can't you see we have a real crisis here? This is what happens when important people trust important events to—" He trailed off, but the implication was clear. I watched Robert Sterling finish his call and approach Derek with a reassuring smile. "Good news," he said. "I've contacted a company that specializes in emergency catering situations. They're mobilizing their team now and should have everything handled within the hour." "How did you manage that?" Derek asked, relief flooding his face. "I have some connections in the hospitality industry," Robert replied modestly. "It's amazing what you can accomplish when you know the right people." My father stepped forward, clearly impressed. "Robert, you're a lifesaver. I don't know how we can thank you." "Just seeing Sarah happy is thanks enough," Robert replied warmly. As I watched this exchange, I felt a strange mixture of pride and frustration. Pride because I worked for a company led by someone who would go to such lengths to help his daughter. Frustration because I knew I could have solved this problem too, probably faster and with less fuss. But my father would never have listened to me long enough to let me try. The wedding coordinator bustled away to coordinate with the incoming catering team, and gradually the panic began to subside. Guests returned to their conversations, the music resumed, and the celebration continued as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed for me. I now knew that Robert Sterling, the man whose leadership had transformed my career, whose business philosophy I'd studied and admired, was standing right here, completely unaware that one of his management team was being publicly humiliated by his own father. "You see?" Dad said, turning back to me as if the crisis had proven his point. "This is what success looks like, Michael. When there's a problem, successful people find solutions. They have connections, resources, and influence. They make things happen." He gestured toward Robert Sterling, who was now chatting quietly with Sarah, making sure she was okay. "That's what real achievement looks like." I nodded slowly, my mind still reeling from the realization of who Robert Sterling was. "You're right, Dad," I said quietly. "That is what success looks like. So maybe now you'll finally understand why—" "I'm so disappointed," Dad continued, his voice softening slightly but still carrying that familiar edge of disapproval. "I'm not trying to be cruel, Michael. I'm trying to wake you up. Look around this room. Look at the people Derek has surrounded himself with. Successful attorneys, business leaders, people who matter. And then ask yourself, what do you bring to the table?" The question hung in the air between us. Around us, the wedding reception was returning to its festive atmosphere, but I felt like I was standing in the eye of a hurricane. Everything was about to change, and my father had no idea what was coming. The familiar sting of my father's words transported me back 25 years, to a childhood where nothing I did was ever quite good enough. Growing up as the younger Thompson's son meant living in Derek's shadow from the moment I could walk. Our house on Maple Avenue in Winnetka was a monument to achievement. Every wall displayed Derek's trophies, academic awards, and newspaper clippings. State champion in debate, valedictorian, full scholarship to Northwestern, the golden child who could do no wrong in Richard Thompson's eyes. I was 7 when I first understood what disappointment looked like on my father's face. Derek had just won his 3rd consecutive spelling bee, and Dad was beaming with pride as local reporters took photos. I'd tugged on his sleeve, excited to show him the short story I'd written about a boy who could talk to animals. "Not now, Michael," he'd said without even looking down. "Can't you see we're busy with important things? A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off." That became the pattern. Derek excelled in everything that mattered to Dad: academics, debate team, student government. Meanwhile, I found myself drawn to different pursuits. I loved building things with my hands, taking apart electronics to see how they worked, and yes, writing stories about magical worlds and impossible adventures. "Michael's living in a fantasy," I once overheard Dad telling Mom after parent-teacher conferences. "Mrs. Henderson says he's bright, but he spends all his time on these creative projects instead of focusing on real subjects. Math, science, history. Those are what matter for his future." Mom had tried to defend me. "Richard, maybe creativity is important too. His English teacher says he has real talent." "Talent?" Dad had laughed bitterly. "You can't build a career on fairy tales, Linda. Look at Derek. He's already talking about following in my footsteps, studying law. That boy has direction, purpose. Michael just drifts." The word drifts became my father's favorite way to describe me. While Derek accumulated accolades and achievements, I was drifting through school, drifting through activities, drifting through life without any clear sense of purpose or direction. The breaking point came during my senior year of high school. Derek was already at Northwestern Law School, earning top marks and impressing his professors. Meanwhile, I was struggling to maintain a B average and had no clear college plans. "Son, we need to talk," Dad had said one evening, calling me into his home office. The room was lined with law books and framed photos of him with judges, politicians, and other important people. Behind his massive oak desk hung his law degree from Harvard, a constant reminder of the standards I was expected to meet. "I've been patient, Michael," he began, not bothering with pleasantries. "I've waited for you to show some initiative, some sign that you're taking your future seriously. But your grades are mediocre. you haven't applied to any serious colleges. And frankly, I'm beginning to wonder if you have any ambition at all. I sat in the leather chair across from his desk, feeling like a defendant awaiting sentencing. Dad, No excuses, he cut me off. I've spoken with admissions counselors at several good schools. With my connections and some intensive tutoring, we might be able to get you into a decent pre-law program. You're a Thompson, Michael. That name means something in this city. It's time you started living up to it. The idea of following Derek and Dad into law filled me with dread. I'd sat through enough dinner conversations about cases and legal strategies to know it wasn't for me. But I also knew that disappointing my father again wasn't an option. What if I'm not cut out for the law? I asked quietly. Dad's expression hardened. Then what are you cut out for? Writing stories? Building model airplanes? Those aren't careers, Michael. Those are hobbies. I won't support a son who refuses to take responsibility for his future. That conversation haunted me through the spring of my senior year. I went through the motions of applying to colleges, even managed to get accepted to a few decent schools with pre-law tracks, but something inside me rebelled against the path being laid out for me. The final straw came at Derek's law school graduation. I watched my father beam with pride as Derek graduated summa cum laude, already having secured a position at a prestigious firm. The whole family was there, aunts, uncles, grandparents, all celebrating Derek's achievement. Next up, Michael, Uncle Tom had said with a hearty laugh, clapping me on the shoulder. Following in the family tradition, eh? I'd forced a smile and nodded, but inside I felt trapped. This wasn't my tradition. This wasn't my dream. I was 18 years old, and I felt like my entire future had been decided without any input from me. That night, back in my childhood bedroom, I made a decision that would change everything. I pulled out a piece of paper and wrote a letter to my parents, explaining that I couldn't follow the path they'd chosen for me. I needed to find my own way, discover what I was actually good at, what made me feel alive and purposeful. I left the letter on the kitchen table before dawn and walked out of the house with nothing but a backpack full of clothes and the $300 I'd saved from my part-time job at the local bookstore. The first few months were harder than I'd ever imagined. I took a bus to Denver, figuring a new city would give me a fresh start. I found a tiny studio apartment and got a job washing dishes at a downtown restaurant. The work was exhausting and the pay was terrible, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I was making my own choices. At night, after long shifts in the restaurant, I'd walk around downtown Denver, fascinated by the energy of the city. I loved watching how businesses operated, how managers coordinated their teams, how successful establishments created experiences that kept customers coming back. After 6 months of washing dishes, I worked up the courage to ask my manager, Carlos, if I could learn other aspects of the business. "You want to move up?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Most dishwashers just want to collect their paycheck and go home." "I want to understand how everything works," I explained. "How you manage inventory, coordinate with suppliers, train staff. I want to learn the business side." Carlos studied me for a long moment. "You remind me of myself 20 years ago," he said finally. "Hungry to learn, willing to work hard. Tell you what, I'll teach you, but you have to prove you're serious. No calling in sick, no shortcuts, no complaining when I give you extra responsibilities." That was the beginning of my real education. Carlos taught me about food service operations, staff management, customer relations, and supply chain logistics. Within a year, I was promoted to assistant manager. Within 2 years, I was running the evening shift. But I knew I wanted something bigger. I started taking night classes in business management and hospitality operations at the local community college. My professors were impressed by my practical experience and encouraged me to aim higher. "Michael," Professor Davis told me after one particularly good presentation on restaurant operations, "you have a natural talent for this. Have you considered getting into hotel management? The skills transfer beautifully, and there's tremendous growth potential in the hospitality industry. That suggestion opened up a whole new world for me. I researched the major hotel chains, studied their management training programs, and eventually landed an entry-level position with Marriott. The starting salary was barely above minimum wage, but it came with training opportunities and a clear path for advancement. The next few years were a whirlwind of learning and growth. I threw myself into understanding every aspect of hotel operations: front desk management, housekeeping coordination, event planning, food service, maintenance, and guest relations. I worked double shifts, volunteered for extra projects, and studied hospitality management in my spare time. My breakthrough came during a particularly chaotic New Year's Eve at the Denver Marriott. The hotel was fully booked. We were hosting 3 major events simultaneously, and our general manager had called in sick with the flu. The assistant GM was overwhelmed, and chaos was brewing. "Thompson," the assistant GM called out desperately, "I need someone who can coordinate the kitchen staff for the main ballroom event. The catering manager is dealing with a crisis in the smaller events." Without hesitation, I stepped up. Drawing on everything Carlos had taught me about food service coordination, plus my hotel training, I organized the kitchen staff, streamlined the service process, and ensured that all 300 guests received their meals on time and properly prepared. The hotel's regional manager happened to be attending one of the events that night. He witnessed the smooth service and asked who had coordinated the kitchen operations. "That was Michael Thompson," the assistant GM told him. "Kid's got real potential. Natural leader, great under pressure." 3 months later, I was promoted to assistant manager at a larger property in Phoenix. Then, 2 years after that, I became the youngest general manager in the region at a boutique hotel in San Diego. But the real turning point came when Sterling Industries acquired our regional hotel group. Suddenly, I was part of a much larger organization with opportunities I'd never dreamed of. Robert Sterling's company was known for treating employees well, investing in their development, and promoting from within. Under Sterling's leadership, my career accelerated rapidly. I was selected for their executive fast-track program, sent to advanced management training seminars, and given increasingly challenging assignments. Within 3 years, I was overseeing operations for multiple properties across Southern California. Now at 26, I was a regional director responsible for 15 hotels and over 800 employees. I managed budgets in the millions, coordinated with corporate executives regularly, and had earned the respect of colleagues throughout the industry. But standing here at Derek's wedding, watching my father's disappointed face, none of that seemed to matter. In his eyes, I was still the son who had walked away from the family tradition, who had chosen to drift rather than follow the respectable path he'd laid out for me. The cruel irony was that Robert Sterling, the man whose company I helped lead, whose trust I earned through years of hard work and dedication, was standing right here, completely unaware of who I was. He'd just solved the catering crisis with the same kind of quick thinking and resource management that I employed every day in my work. I wondered what my father would say if he knew that the man he was so impressed with was actually my boss. Would it change his opinion of me? Or would he find some way to diminish even that accomplishment? As I watched Robert Sterling continue to charm the wedding guests with his quiet competence and genuine warmth, I felt a strange mix of pride and frustration. Pride because I worked for someone I genuinely admired. Frustration because the recognition I craved from my father might be standing just a few feet away, if only he knew the truth. The humiliation at Derek's wedding wasn't new. It was just the latest chapter in a story that had been writing itself for 26 years. As I stood there, watching my father bask in Robert Sterling's competence while dismissing my very existence, my mind drifted back to where it all began. Growing up as Richard Thompson's son meant living under a microscope of impossible expectations. Our house on Elm Street wasn't just a home, it was a monument to achievement. The walls were lined with Derek's academic awards, sports trophies, and newspaper clippings from his debate team victories. My father's law degrees hung prominently in his home office, alongside photos of him with judges, politicians, and business leaders. Even our dinner conversations revolved around success stories, cases Dad had won, deals he'd closed, people he'd impressed. Derek had slipped into this world as easily as putting on a favorite jacket. At 8 years old, he was already showing signs of the quick wit and natural charisma that would serve him well in law school. He could charm adults at Dad's firm parties, debate complex topics at the dinner table, and somehow always know exactly what to say to make Dad's eyes light up with pride. I, on the other hand, was the square peg trying to fit into a round hole. While Derek excelled at everything that mattered to Dad, I found myself drawn to things that were considered frivolous or impractical. I loved working with my hands, building model airplanes, fixing broken electronics, figuring out how things worked. When other kids were playing video games, I was taking apart old radios to see what made them tick. When Derek was studying legal precedents for fun, I was reading technical manuals and watching documentaries about engineering marvels. Michael's more of a hands-on learner, my mother would say diplomatically when teachers or family friends asked about my academic performance. It was her gentle way of explaining why my report cards never quite measured up to Derek's straight A's. Dad saw it differently. "The boy lacks focus," he'd tell Mom when he thought I wasn't listening. "He's smart enough, but he wastes his time on nonsense instead of applying himself to what matters." The breaking point came during my junior year of high school. I was 17, struggling through advanced placement classes that I'd been pushed into because Thompson boys don't take regular courses. My grades were mediocre at best, and I was spending most of my free time working part-time at Morrison's Electronics, a small repair shop downtown where old Mr. Morrison let me tinker with broken devices and actually learn something useful. That's where I was in the afternoon when everything changed. I was in the back of Morrison's shop, successfully repairing a vintage television that 3 other technicians had given up on, when Dad stormed in. His face was red with anger, his usually perfect hair slightly disheveled from what I would later learn had been a heated phone conversation with my guidance counselor. "Michael Anthony Thompson," he said, using my full name the way he did when he was preparing to deliver a verdict. "We need to talk, now." I set down my soldering iron and followed him outside to his BMW, where he proceeded to tear apart my life with the systematic precision of a prosecuting attorney. "Mrs. Henderson called me today," he began, referring to my guidance counselor. "She wanted to discuss your college applications. Do you know what she told me?" I shook my head, though I had a sinking feeling I knew where this was going. "She told me that with your current GPA and test scores, you're looking at community college." "Community college, Michael. Do you understand what that means for this family's reputation?" "Dad, I know my grades aren't great, but..." "Not great?" He cut me off with a bitter laugh. "Your brother had 7 university acceptance letters by this time in his senior year. 7, including Northwestern, where he's now thriving in pre-law. And you're telling me that not great is acceptable?" I tried to explain about my interests, about the electronics work I was passionate about the possibility of studying engineering technology. But Dad wasn't interested in hearing about alternative paths. "This ends now," he declared. "You're quitting that ridiculous job at the repair shop. You're going to spend every free moment studying and bringing your grades up to Thompson family standards. And if you can't handle the academic track, then maybe it's time you learned what real disappointment feels like." That night at dinner, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Derek, home from Northwestern for spring break, tried to lighten the mood by sharing stories from his constitutional law class. Mom kept glancing between Dad and me, clearly hoping someone would break the uncomfortable silence I'd maintained since the confrontation at Morrison's. "So, Michael," Derek finally said, clearly trying to include me in the conversation, Mom mentioned you've been working at an electronics shop. That sounds pretty cool. What kind of stuff do you fix? Before I could answer, Dad set down his fork, with a sharp clink against his plate. Michael won't be working there anymore, he announced. It's time he focused on his real responsibilities instead of playing with toys. They're not toys, I said quietly, the words escaping before I could stop them. Excuse me? Dad's voice dropped to that dangerous low tone that meant I was on thin ice. The electronics. They're not toys. Yesterday, I fixed a 40-year-old amplifier that 3 certified technicians couldn't repair. Last week, I restored a radio that belonged to someone's grandfather. These aren't toys. They're valuable equipment that people depend on. Dad stared at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he laughed. Not with humor, but with the kind of cold dismissal that I'd learned to fear more than his, anger. Valuable equipment, he repeated. Michael, do you know what I bill per hour? Do you know what Derek will be earning when he graduates law school? That little hobby of yours might seem impressive to you, but in the real world, it's meaningless. No one cares if you can fix a broken radio when there are serious problems that need solving. But people do care, I insisted, my voice growing stronger despite the warning look Mom was giving me. Mr. Morrison has customers who drive from 3 towns over because they know we can fix things that other places would just throw away. That matters to them. To them, maybe, Dad said dismissively. But not to anyone who matters in the real world. Not to employers, not to universities, not to the kind of people who will determine your future success. The conversation ended there, but the damage was done. Over the following months, Dad made good on his threat. I was forbidden from working at Morrison's, forced to spend every afternoon with tutors who tried to cram academic subjects into my head, while my hands itched to build something, fix something, create something useful. My grades improved marginally, but not enough to satisfy Dad's standards. When college acceptance letters started arriving, thin envelopes from schools I'd never really wanted to attend anyway, each rejection felt like another nail in the coffin of my relationship with my father. The final blow came on a humid evening in May, just 3 weeks before graduation. I'd been accepted to Central State University's engineering technology program, not the prestigious 4-year engineering degree Dad had hoped for, but a solid program that would let me work with my hands while learning practical skills. I brought the acceptance letter home, thinking maybe this would be enough. Maybe Dad would see that I had found my path, even if it wasn't the one he'd chosen for me. Instead, he took one look at the letter and shook his head in disgust. Central State, he said, as if the words tasted bitter. A technical program. Michael, do you realize what you're throwing away? Do you understand that you're choosing to be mediocre? I'm choosing to do something I'm good at, I replied, surprised by my own boldness. Good at? Dad laughed harshly. You think being a technician is something to be proud of? You think fixing other people's broken things is an achievement worth celebrating? Yes, I said simply. I do. That's when he said the words that would echo in my head for the next 8 years. Then you're an even bigger disappointment than I thought. And if that's the path you choose, don't expect this family to pretend it's something to be proud of. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom reached for my hand across the dinner table, tears in her eyes, but Dad just stood up and walked away, leaving me sitting there with my acceptance letter and the crushing realization that I would never be enough for him. 3 months later, I left for Central State with a single suitcase and a determination to prove that there was value in the work I loved, even if my father would never see it. I threw myself into my studies, discovering that when I was learning about systems I cared about, electrical circuits, mechanical engineering, project management, I was actually quite capable. But Dad's words haunted me. Every success felt hollow because I knew he'd dismiss it as meaningless. Every achievement was overshadowed by the knowledge that in his eyes, I was still just playing with toys while Derek built a real career. Now, standing at Derek's wedding reception, watching Robert Sterling handle a crisis with the same kind of competence I'd learned to value in my own work, I realized that Dad's definition of success had become my prison. For 8 years, I'd been measuring my worth by his standards instead of recognizing the value of what I'd actually accomplished. But that was about to change, because Robert Sterling was about to discover that the family disappointment standing before him was actually one of his most valuable employees. The morning I decided to cut ties with my family started like any other Tuesday in my sophomore year, at Central State University. I was in Professor Martinez's Advanced Systems Integration class, completely absorbed in a project involving automated facility management, when my phone buzzed with a text from Mom. "Your father wants to see your grades. Can you call home tonight?" My stomach dropped. It was mid-semester, and while I was excelling in my technical courses, I was struggling with a required literature class that had nothing to do with my major, but everything to do with the university's general education requirements. I knew Dad would focus on that one B- like a laser, ignoring the A's I was earning in courses that actually mattered to my future. That evening, I made the dreaded call home. Mom answered, her voice immediately tense. "Hi, sweetheart. Your father's been asking about your academic progress. He wants to make sure you're taking this seriously." Before I could respond, I heard Dad's voice in the background. "Put him on speaker, Linda. I want to hear this directly." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in systematic humiliation. Dad had somehow obtained a copy of my mid-semester grades, probably through some connection at the university registrar's office, and he went through each course methodically, treating my academic performance like evidence in a court case. Engineering. Mathematics, A-. Acceptable, though Derek never got anything below an A in his math courses. He began. Systems analysis, A. Fine. Technical drawing, A. These are all vocational subjects, Michael. Let's talk about your real courses. Here. It came. English literature, B-. Philosophy, C+. Michael, these are fundamental courses that develop critical thinking and communication skills. How do you expect to advance in any meaningful career if you can't master basic academic disciplines? I tried to explain that I was spending most of my time on an independent project with Professor Martinez, designing an integrated building management system that could optimize energy usage across multiple facilities. It was cutting-edge work that had caught the attention of several industry professionals who'd heard about it through academic conferences. Dad wasn't interested. "Michael, you're missing the point entirely. Derek is at Northwestern learning constitutional, law, international relations, advanced legal theory. He's preparing to make real decisions that affect real people, and you're, what, playing with thermostats?" "It's not playing with thermostats," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "I'm developing systems that could save companies millions of dollars in energy costs while reducing environmental impact. Professor Martinez thinks it could be commercially viable." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then, Dad's laughter, that cold, dismissive sound I'd learned to hate. "Commercially viable," he repeated. "Michael, do you know what Derek did last week? He presented a case analysis to a panel of federal judges." "Federal judges, Michael. People who shape the law of the land? And you think some gadget that adjusts air conditioning is somehow equivalent?" That's when something inside me snapped, not with anger exactly, but with a crystalline clarity I'd never experienced before. At that moment, I realized I was done trying to translate my achievements into a language Dad would respect. I was done seeking validation from someone who would never see value in anything I did. "You know what, Dad?" I said quietly. "You're right. What?" He sounded confused, probably expecting me to argue or defend myself as usual. "You're absolutely right. Derek is going to be a successful lawyer, just like you. He's going to make a partner at some prestigious firm, argue cases in front of important judges, and do exactly what you've always wanted him to do. Well, yes. That's what I've been trying to tell you. And I'm never going to be him, I continued, my voice growing stronger. I'm never going to care about constitutional law or legal precedents or impressing federal judges. I care about solving practical problems that make people's lives better. I care about building things that work and fixing things that are broken. And if that makes me a disappointment to you, then that's something I'm going to have to live with. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. When Dad finally spoke, his voice was ice cold. If that's truly how you feel, Michael, then perhaps it's time you learned to live with the consequences of your choices without expecting support from this family. What's that supposed to mean? It means, son, that if you want to throw away your potential and settle for mediocrity, you can do it on your own dime. Don't expect me to continue funding an education that you're clearly not taking seriously. Mom's sharp intake of breath was audible through the phone. Richard, that's not… No, Linda. I've been patient long enough. Michael has made his priorities clear. If he wants to waste his time on vocational training instead of developing real academic credentials, he can find his own way to pay for it. The call ended with Dad hanging up, leaving me staring at my phone in my tiny dorm room. The immediate panic of losing financial support was quickly replaced by something unexpected: relief. For the first time in my life, the decision about my future was entirely in my hands. Within a week, I had withdrawn from Central State and enrolled in a more affordable technical certification program at Riverside Community College. I found a job at Peterson Electronics, a regional company that specialized in commercial building automation systems. The pay wasn't much, but it covered my basic expenses and gave me hands-on experience with the kind of systems I'd been studying. The irony wasn't lost on me that Dad's attempt to punish me had actually freed me to pursue exactly the path I wanted to follow. At Peterson Electronics, I discovered something remarkable. I wasn't just good at this work, I was exceptional. Within 6 months, I was troubleshooting problems that had stumped senior technicians. Within a year, I was designing custom solutions for complex facilities. Management challenges. The company's clients began specifically requesting me for their most difficult projects. My supervisor, Janet Chen, became the first mentor I'd ever had who understood what I was capable of. She was a brilliant engineer who'd left a corporate job to focus on practical applications of technology, and she saw something in me that my own father had missed. "You have an intuitive understanding of systems," she told me during my first performance review. "Most people see individual components, a thermostat here, a sensor there. You see the whole picture, how everything connects and affects everything else. That's rare." Under Janet's guidance, I learned not just the technical aspects of building management, but the business side as well. How to assess client needs, design cost-effective solutions, manage project timelines, and lead implementation teams. She encouraged me to pursue additional certifications, and even sponsored my attendance at industry conferences, where I began building a network of professional contacts. The breakthrough came in my 3rd year at Peterson Electronics. A major hotel chain was struggling with massive energy inefficiencies across their properties. Their facilities were hemorrhaging money through poor climate control, outdated lighting systems, and equipment that ran constantly regardless of actual need. 3 different consulting firms had proposed solutions, but none had been able to deliver meaningful results. Janet assigned me to the project as a junior team member, but when the senior engineer became ill, I found myself leading the assessment. What I discovered was a perfect storm of incompatible systems, poor integration, and decades of Band-Aid fixes that had created an impossibly complex web of inefficiency. Instead of trying to work within the existing framework, I proposed something radical: a complete system redesign that would integrate all building functions into a single, intelligent network. The initial cost would be significant, but the energy savings would pay for the upgrade within 18 months, and the long-term benefits would be enormous. The hotel chain's executives were skeptical. This wasn't the kind of minor adjustment they'd been expecting from a small regional firm. But Janet believed in the proposal, and more importantly, she believed in me. This could change everything for Peterson Electronics, she told me as we prepared for the presentation. If you can pull this off, Michael, you won't be working for someone else much longer. The presentation was scheduled for a Thursday morning in downtown Chicago, in a gleaming conference room filled with executives who looked like they'd stepped out of the same mold as my father. As I stood there explaining my integrated systems approach, I felt like I was speaking a different language, not the language of legal precedents and academic credentials, but the language of practical solutions and measurable results. When I finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then the vice president of operations, a woman named Margaret Foster, leaned forward with a smile. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "this is exactly the kind of innovative thinking we've been looking for. When can you start implementation?" 6 months later, the first phase of the project was complete, and the energy savings exceeded even my optimistic projections. The hotel chain was so impressed that they offered Peterson Electronics an exclusive contract to upgrade all their properties nationwide. More importantly, they offered me a position as their Director of Facilities Innovation. It was an opportunity that would change my life, but it meant leaving Janet and the company that had given me my start. As I sat in Janet's office, trying to decide whether to take the job, she made the decision easy. "Michael, I hired you because I saw potential. But what you've accomplished here goes beyond anything I imagined. This hotel chain is just the beginning. They're part of a larger corporate family that includes hospitality, retail, and commercial real estate divisions. If you take this job, you'll be positioned to make a real impact on a massive scale." Was right, of course. The hotel chain was a subsidiary of Sterling Industries, and Margaret Foster had mentioned that successful directors often moved into broader roles within the parent company. It was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been working toward, even if I hadn't fully realized it at the time. The morning I left Peterson Electronics, Janet gave me a piece of advice that would prove prophetic. "Remember, Michael, success isn't about proving your father wrong. It's about proving yourself right. And from what I've seen, you're going to go places that will surprise everyone, maybe even yourself." As I drove away from the small office building where I'd learned to believe in my own abilities, I thought about calling home to share the news of my promotion, but I realized I didn't need my father's approval anymore. I had found my own definition of success, and it was built on solving real problems for real people, not on meeting someone else's expectations. I had no idea that 5 years later I would be standing in a wedding reception, watching my father dismiss me as a failure, while the CEO of my company stood just a few feet away, completely unaware that the family disappointment was actually one of his most valuable team members. The boy who had left home in shame was gone. In his place stood a man who had built something meaningful with his own hands and his own mind. And soon, everyone would know it. My first day as Director of Facilities Innovation at Sterling Hospitality felt like stepping into a different universe. The corporate headquarters in Denver occupied 3 floors of a gleaming tower that seemed to touch the clouds. Everything from the marble lobby to the executive conference rooms screamed success in a way that would have impressed even my father, though I tried not to think about that as I was escorted to my new office. Margaret Foster, who had become my strongest advocate during the hotel chain project, personally showed me around the facilities. She was a sharp woman in her early 40s who had climbed the corporate ladder through a combination of brilliant strategic thinking and an uncanny ability to identify talent. "Michael, I want you to understand something," she said as we stood, in my corner office overlooking the Rocky Mountains. "This position didn't exist 6 months ago. We created it specifically because of what you accomplished with our energy efficiency project. You're not just filling a role. You're pioneering an entirely new approach to how Sterling Industries thinks about facility management. The scope of my new responsibilities was staggering. Sterling Industries owned over 400 properties across North America: hotels, resorts, office buildings, retail centers, and industrial facilities. Each property had its own unique challenges, from aging infrastructure to incompatible systems that had been cobbled together over decades of ownership changes and renovations. My job was to develop standardized solutions that could be implemented across the entire portfolio while remaining flexible enough to address individual property needs. It was exactly the kind of complex, large-scale problem that energized me, but the pressure was unlike anything I'd experienced before. Within my first month, I was managing a team of 12 engineers and technicians, coordinating with property managers across multiple time zones, and presenting progress reports to executive committees that included some of the most powerful people in the hospitality industry. The learning curve was steep, but I discovered that my years of hands-on experience gave me insights that many of my MBA-educated colleagues lacked. The real test came during my third month, when Sterling Industries acquired Pinnacle Resorts, a luxury hotel chain with properties in some of the most exclusive destinations in the world. The acquisition was strategic. Sterling wanted to expand into the ultra-high-end market, but it came with a massive challenge. Pinnacle's facilities were beautiful but incredibly inefficient. The previous owners had prioritized aesthetics over functionality, resulting in properties that were bleeding money through energy waste, maintenance issues, and systems that required constant manual intervention. The integration needed to happen quickly, but any disruption to guest services at these luxury properties could destroy Sterling's reputation in the premium market. "This is your moment, Michael," Margaret told me during the project kickoff meeting. "If you can successfully integrate Pinnacle's properties without impacting guest satisfaction, you'll have proven that your approach can work at any level of the market." The project required everything I'd learned about systems integration, but on a scale that demanded entirely new approaches. I couldn't simply apply the same solutions I'd used for business hotels to properties where guests were paying $2,000 per night and expecting perfection in every detail. I spent weeks at each Pinnacle property, working alongside housekeeping staff, maintenance teams, and guest services personnel to understand how the facilities actually functioned from a user perspective. I discovered that the most expensive properties often had the most fundamental problems: gorgeous facades hiding antiquated mechanical systems, stunning lobbies with climate control that couldn't maintain consistent temperatures, and beautiful rooms where guests complained about everything from water pressure to noise levels. The solution I developed became known internally as the invisible integration approach. Instead of disrupting existing operations, I designed systems that would gradually replace outdated infrastructure during routine maintenance windows. Smart sensors were installed during regular cleaning. New climate control systems were implemented, floor by floor during seasonal maintenance periods. Energy management systems were integrated with existing building automation during off-peak hours. The key was making each upgrade transparent to guests while providing immediate benefits to operations staff. Housekeepers found their work easier when rooms maintained consistent temperatures automatically. Maintenance teams could identify and resolve issues before they affected guest experiences. Front desk staff received real-time alerts about everything, from room readiness to potential equipment problems. 6 months into the Pinnacle integration, the results exceeded everyone's expectations. Energy costs had dropped by 35% across all properties, guest satisfaction scores had improved by 18%, and maintenance-related service disruptions had virtually disappeared. More importantly, the approach had proven scalable. We were already implementing similar strategies across Sterling's entire portfolio. The success caught the attention of Robert Sterling himself. I'd heard his name countless times during meetings and conference calls, but he remained an almost mythical figure, the visionary CEO who had transformed a small family business into a hospitality empire. When Margaret called to tell me that Mr. Sterling wanted to meet with me personally, I felt like I was being summoned to meet a celebrity. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in his executive conference room. I spent the weekend preparing presentations, reviewing financial data, and trying to anticipate every possible question about the Pinnacle project. When the day arrived, I put on my best suit and made sure I had backup copies of every document I might need. Robert Sterling was not what I expected. Instead of the intimidating corporate titan I'd imagined, I met a man who was genuinely curious about the technical details of my work. He asked thoughtful questions about energy efficiency algorithms, wanted to understand the specific challenges of integrating legacy systems, and seemed fascinated by the guest experience improvements we'd achieved. "Michael," he said as our meeting wrapped up, "what you've accomplished with Pinnacle represents exactly the kind of innovation that will keep Sterling Industries competitive in a changing market. I'm promoting you to Vice President of Systems Integration, effective immediately." The promotion came with a substantial salary increase, a larger team, and responsibility for developing integration strategies that would be applied to all of Sterling's future acquisitions. More importantly, it meant I was now part of the senior leadership team that shaped the company's strategic direction. Over the next 2 years, I found myself traveling constantly, evaluating potential acquisitions, overseeing integration projects, and developing standardized approaches that could be deployed across Sterling's expanding portfolio. The work was demanding but incredibly rewarding. I was solving problems on a scale that affected thousands of employees and hundreds of thousands of guests annually. The personal satisfaction went beyond professional success. I was finally doing work that mattered in ways my father had never understood. When I optimized a hotel's energy systems, it didn't just save money, it reduced environmental impact. When I improved facility automation, it didn't just increase efficiency, it made life easier for housekeepers, maintenance staff, and front desk employees who were often overworked and underpaid. I remember one particular project at a Sterling resort in Colorado where the previous systems required housekeeping staff to manually check and adjust thermostats in every room. It added significant time to their already challenging workload. The automated system I implemented freed up nearly 2 hours per day for each housekeeper, time they could spend on tasks that actually improved guest experiences. Maria Santos, the head of housekeeping, thanked me personally when the system went. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "you have no idea what this means to my team. For the first time in years, we can finish our work without feeling like we're constantly running behind." Moments like that reminded me why I'd chosen this path despite my father's disapproval. I wasn't just moving numbers on a spreadsheet or impressing executives in conference rooms. I was making a real difference in real people's daily lives. The recognition came from unexpected places. Industry publications began featuring articles about Sterling's innovative approaches to facility management. Conference organizers invited me to speak about systems integration strategies. Other companies tried to recruit me with increasingly attractive offers. But the most meaningful recognition came from within Sterling Industries itself. Robert Sterling began including me in strategic planning sessions that went far beyond facilities management. He valued my perspective on operational efficiency and often asked for my input on potential acquisitions based on the technical challenges they might present. During one memorable session, we were evaluating a potential acquisition of a commercial real estate portfolio that included some of the most prestigious office buildings in major cities. The financial projections looked attractive, but I identified several infrastructure issues that would require significant investment to resolve. "The buildings look impressive," I told the acquisition team, "but the underlying systems are decades out of date. We're looking at a minimum of $50 million in upgrades just to bring them up to modern efficiency standards." The room went quiet. This was the kind of analysis that could kill a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Robert Sterling leaned back in his chair, considering my assessment. "Michael, if we made those investments, What kind of operational improvements could we expect? I walked them through the projected benefits: energy savings, reduced maintenance costs, improved tenant satisfaction, and competitive advantages in attracting premium renters. By the time I finished, it was clear that the infrastructure investment would pay for itself within 3 years while positioning Sterling as a leader in sustainable commercial real estate. "This is exactly why we need people like Michael on our team," Robert said to the room. "He doesn't just see problems, he sees opportunities that others miss." The acquisition went forward, and the subsequent integration project became one of my most challenging and successful endeavors. It also established me as Sterling's go-to expert for evaluating and implementing complex facility transformations. By my 5th year with Sterling Industries, I was overseeing a department of 43 employees across 6 regional offices. My team was responsible for facility operations at over 600 properties, and our innovations had become industry standards that competitors tried to replicate. I had built something that mattered, something that created value for thousands of people. Every day, I had proven that practical problem-solving could be just as valuable as any legal argument or academic achievement. Most importantly, I had found my own definition of success, one that didn't depend on my father's approval or recognition. Standing at Derek's wedding reception, watching Robert Sterling handle the catering crisis with the same kind of competent leadership I'd come to admire in our corporate meetings, I realized that the family disappointment my father saw when he looked at me was actually one of his most trusted executives, and soon he was going to find out exactly how wrong he'd been about what constitutes real success. The morning of Derek's wedding, I woke up in my downtown Chicago hotel room with a knot in my stomach that had nothing to do with the continental breakfast. I hadn't seen my family in person for over 3 years, and the last conversation with my father had ended with him hanging up when I'd politely declined to loan Derek money for his wedding expenses. "I don't need charity from my failure of a brother," Derek had said when Dad suggested he ask me for help. The irony wasn't lost on me. Derek, the successful lawyer, needing financial assistance from Michael, the family disappointment. But I'd offered anyway, quietly sending Mom a check with instructions to give it to Derek without mentioning where it came from. As I adjusted my tie in the hotel mirror, I caught myself practicing casual responses to the inevitable questions about my life. "Oh, I work in facility management. Just some technical consulting. Nothing too exciting." I'd learned to downplay my career when talking to Dad's circle of lawyers and judges, having discovered years ago that mentioning Sterling Industries only led to uncomfortable questions about how someone like me had ended up in a position of responsibility. The wedding venue was the Grandview Ballroom, an elegant space that Derek and Sarah had chosen for its classic architecture and reputation for hosting society weddings. As I walked through the marble-columned entrance, I was immediately struck by the guest list. Chicago's legal elite mingled with business leaders and politicians, their conversations a mixture of shop talk and social pleasantries that I remembered from my childhood. What I hadn't expected was to recognize the venue itself. As I looked around the ornate ballroom with its crystal chandeliers and mahogany details, I realized this was one of the properties in Sterling's luxury events portfolio. We'd acquired the Grandview Group about 2 years ago, and I'd personally overseen the integration of their booking systems and facility management protocols. The recognition gave me an odd sense of confidence. This wasn't just Derek's territory anymore. In a very real sense, I had more authority in this building than anyone else at the wedding. Not that I was planning to mention that fact. I found Mom near the bridal party area, looking elegant but stressed in her mother of the groom dress. Her face lit up when she saw me, and for a moment I forgot about all the family tension. "Michael, you look so handsome," she said, embracing me warmly. "I was worried you might change your mind about coming." "I wouldn't miss Derek's big day," I replied, though we both knew it was more complicated than that. "Your father's been asking about you," she said carefully. "He's curious about what you've been up to." Before I could respond, Derek appeared with Sarah on his arm. My brother looked every inch the successful attorney in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, but I was surprised to see genuine warmth in his eyes when he spotted me. "Mike, you actually made it," he said, using the childhood nickname I hadn't heard in years. "Sarah, this is my brother Michael, the one I told you about." Sarah Sterling was even more beautiful than her wedding photos had suggested. She had the kind of natural grace that came from growing up in wealthy circles, but her smile seemed genuinely warm as she extended her hand. "I'm so glad to finally meet you, Michael. Derek's told me so much about your technical expertise. My father actually works in a similar field. He's always fascinating to talk to about industry developments." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Your father works in technical fields?" "Oh, yes. He runs Sterling Industries. They're one of the largest hospitality and facility management companies in the country. Maybe you've heard of them?" The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Sarah Sterling. Sterling Industries. Robert Sterling was Derek's new father-in-law, which meant my brother had married into the family that owned the company where I was a senior executive. Yes, I'm familiar with Sterling Industries," I managed to say, my mind racing through the implications. Before we could continue the conversation, Derek was pulled away by his groomsmen for pre-ceremony photos, leaving me standing in the reception area trying to process this revelation. The man whose business philosophy I'd studied, whose strategic vision had shaped my career development, whose personal approval had become more meaningful to me than my own father's, that man was about to become my brother's father-in-law. Spent the next hour in a strange state of suspended anxiety, watching from the sidelines as the wedding preparations continued around me. Every glimpse of Robert Sterling, directing photographers, greeting guests, handling last-minute logistics with the calm efficiency I'd observed in countless corporate meetings, reinforced the surreal nature of the situation. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Derek and Sarah exchanged vows in the Grandview's chapel with genuine emotion that made even my cynical heart soften slightly. As I watched my brother promise to love and cherish this woman, I found myself hoping that maybe this new chapter in his life might also mean a new chapter for our family relationships. That optimism lasted exactly until the reception began. I was standing near the bar, nursing a glass of wine and trying to decide whether to approach Robert Sterling, when Dad materialized beside me with the predatory look I remembered from his cross-examination days. "Well, Michael, you clean up nicely for someone who works with his hands," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to catch the attention of nearby guests. "Hello, Dad. Nice to see you too. I've been wondering what you've been up to these past few years. Your mother mentioned you were working for some company in Denver, but she was rather vague about the details. I could feel other people starting to listen to our conversation. Dad had a talent for creating public moments that felt private, drawing an audience without seeming to perform. I do systems integration and facility management, I said simply, hoping to avoid elaboration. Systems integration? Dad repeated thoughtfully. That sounds very technical, very specialized. The way he said it made it sound like a communicable disease. It can be. And you're happy with this career choice? Content to work in maintenance while your brother builds a real practice? The conversation was heading in a familiar direction. But before I could respond, the wedding coordinator appeared with panic written across her face. As she explained the catering crisis to Derek and Sarah, I watched the color drain from my brother's face. This was exactly the kind of operational emergency I dealt with regularly at Sterling Properties. In fact, given that this was a Sterling venue, I probably had more authority to resolve the situation than anyone else in the room. But revealing that would mean exposing my position within the company, which would raise questions I wasn't ready to answer. I watched as Robert Sterling took charge of the situation with the same calm competence I'd observed in corporate crises. He was already on his phone, calling in favors and mobilizing resources to save his daughter's reception. As I listened to him handle the emergency, I felt a familiar surge of professional admiration mixed with personal anxiety. This was my boss's boss, the CEO whose leadership style I'd studied and emulated, whose corporate vision had shaped my own approach to problem solving. And he was about to discover that the family failure being publicly humiliated by Richard Thompson was actually one of his most trusted executives. The catering coordinator appeared again, this time with updates from Robert Sterling's emergency response team. Relief flooded Derek's face as he learned that replacement meals were already being prepared and would arrive within the hour. "How did you manage that so quickly?" Derek asked Robert Sterling, clearly impressed. "I have some connections in the hospitality industry," Robert replied modestly. "It's amazing what you can accomplish when you know the right people and understand how these operations work." Dad stepped forward, clearly eager to associate himself with this display of competence and influence. "Robert, that was masterful. It takes real business acumen to handle a crisis like that so efficiently." "Thank you, Richard. In my line of work, you learn that emergencies are just problems waiting for solutions. The key is having good people who understand systems and can implement fixes quickly." "Exactly," Dad agreed enthusiastically. "That's what separates real business leaders from—" He glanced pointedly at me. "People who just work in technical support roles." The irony was so thick I could almost taste it. Here was my father, praising the exact kind of problem-solving expertise that I'd spent years developing, while simultaneously dismissing my career as meaningless technical work. Robert Sterling caught Dad's glance in my direction and seemed to notice me for the first time. There was something in his expression, a flicker of recognition that made my pulse quicken. But before he could say anything, Dad continued his impromptu lecture on success and leadership. "You see, Michael," Dad said, his voice carrying clearly, "across the nearby area, this is what real achievement looks like. When there's a crisis, successful people don't just understand the technical details. They have the authority and connections to actually solve problems. They make things happen." "That's very true," Robert Sterling agreed, but his eyes remained fixed on me with growing intensity. "My son here works in facility management," Dad continued, apparently oblivious to Robert Sterling's reaction. "I'm sure he understands the technical side of what you just accomplished, but he doesn't have the business relationships or executive authority to actually implement solutions at this level." I felt trapped between my desire to avoid family conflict and my growing discomfort at being misrepresented in front of my CEO. Robert Sterling was still staring at me, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind as he tried to place where he'd seen me before. "Facility management is actually more complex than most people realize," Robert Sterling said carefully, his tone neutral but his attention laser-focused on me. "The best people in that field often have tremendous authority and responsibility. They're the ones who actually make things work behind the scenes." "Oh, I'm sure there are some competent technicians," Dad replied dismissively. "But let's be honest, there's a difference between being good at your job and being a real leader who shapes industry direction." That's when Robert Sterling's expression shifted from puzzlement to recognition to something that looked suspiciously like suppressed amusement. "You know," he said slowly, "I think you might be surprised by how much influence the right facility management professional can have. Some of them are involved in strategic decisions that affect entire corporations." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah approaching with gratitude radiating from her face. "Daddy, I can't thank you enough for saving the reception. You're absolutely amazing." "Just glad I could help, sweetheart," Robert replied, but his eyes were still fixed on me with an expression I couldn't quite read. As the immediate crisis subsided and guests began returning to their conversations, I realized that the evening was about to take a dramatic turn. Robert Sterling had recognized me, and the carefully constructed separation between my professional success and family disappointment was about to collapse entirely. The only question was whether that revelation would vindicate me or destroy what little relationship remained with my father, The tension in the air was so thick it felt like walking through fog. Robert Sterling stood there, his recognition of me becoming more apparent with each passing second, while my father continued his oblivious monologue about success and leadership. I could see the exact moment when Robert's puzzle pieces clicked into place. His eyebrows raised slightly, a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, and he straightened with the bearing of a man who had just realized he was about to witness something extraordinary. "You know, Richard," Robert Sterling said, his voice taking on a tone that made several nearby guests turn their attention toward our group. "I'm curious about your son's work in facility management. What exactly does he do?" Dad's chest puffed, up with the confidence of someone about to deliver a verdict. "Oh, Michael's been doing some kind of technical consulting for the past few years. Maintenance systems, I believe. Nothing too complex. Mainly troubleshooting equipment problems for hotels and office buildings." The oversimplification of my career was so absurd that I almost laughed, but Robert Sterling's expression had shifted into something I recognized from board meetings when he was about to make a point that would change the entire direction of a discussion. "Troubleshooting equipment problems," Robert repeated thoughtfully. "That's interesting. And where did you say he works?" "Some company in Denver," Dad replied with a dismissive wave. "Sterling something or other, I think. Your typical mid-level technical firm." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert Sterling's smile widened, and I could see him processing the delicious irony of the situation. Around us, wedding guests continued their conversations, completely unaware that a family drama was about to unfold that would redefine everything. "Sterling Industries," Robert Sterling said slowly, savoring each word. "Your son works for Sterling Industries." "That's right," Dad confirmed, still completely missing the significance. "Like I said, nothing too impressive. Probably one of dozens of technicians they have on staff." Derek, who had been only half listening while coordinating with the wedding photographer, suddenly froze. His face went pale as he looked between Robert Sterling and me, clearly beginning to understand that something monumental was happening. "Dad," Derek said urgently, "maybe we should—" "No, Derek, I think this conversation is quite enlightening," Robert Sterling interrupted gently, his eyes twinkling with barely contained amusement. "I'm particularly interested in hearing more about Michael's role as one of dozens of technicians." Mom appeared at my elbow, her maternal instincts clearly sensing danger. "Richard, perhaps this isn't the time." "Actually, Linda, I think this is the perfect time," Robert Sterling said with growing confidence. "You see, I have a very personal interest in Sterling Industries." Dad's expression shifted slightly, a hint of uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Oh, do you have some business relationship with the company?" "You could say that," Robert Sterling replied, his tone now carrying the full weight of his authority. "I founded Sterling Industries 37 years ago. I'm the chairman and CEO." The words hit Dad like a physical blow. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, realization, and then something approaching horror as he began to understand the implications of what he'd been saying. You're Robert Sterling," Dad stammered, his usual eloquence deserting him completely. "I am indeed, and Michael here." Robert Sterling turned to me with an expression of genuine warmth and respect. "Is one of my most valued senior executives, Vice President of Systems Integration to be precise." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear the ice clinking in someone's glass 3 tables away. Derek's mouth was hanging slightly open. Sarah had covered her mouth with both hands, and Mom looked like she might faint, but it was Dad's expression that I'll remember for the rest of my life. The man who had spent years dismissing my career as meaningless technical work was staring at me as if I'd suddenly grown a second head. "Vice President," Dad repeated weakly. "Oh, it's much more than just a title," Robert Sterling continued, clearly enjoying himself now. "Michael has revolutionized how we approach facility integration across our entire portfolio. His innovations have saved us millions of dollars annually while improving operational efficiency at hundreds of properties." He turned to address the growing circle of guests who had been drawn by the unusual tension in our conversation. In fact, Michael was personally responsible for the successful integration of our Pinnacle Resorts acquisition, one of the most complex facility management projects in industry history. Sarah found her voice first. Wait, you're the Michael Thompson who redesigned all the climate systems at the Aspen property. Daddy talks about that project constantly. He calls it the gold standard for sustainable luxury hospitality. That would be me, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. Robert Sterling nodded enthusiastically. Michael's approach to invisible integration has become the industry standard. Other companies are spending millions trying to replicate what he developed for us. Derek stepped forward, his expression a mixture of awe and confusion. Mike, I had no idea. When you said you worked in facility management, I thought, you thought what your father told you to think, Robert Sterling said gently but firmly. You thought that working with your hands meant working without your brain. That solving practical problems was somehow less valuable than arguing theoretical ones. Dad's face had progressed from pale to red to an alarming shade of purple. I didn't realize. Of course you didn't, Robert Sterling replied, his tone becoming more serious. Because you never bothered to ask what Michael actually did. You made assumptions based on your own limited definition of success. He turned back to me, his expression softening. Michael, I have to say, this explains a few things about your character that I've always admired. The humility, the focus on getting results rather than taking credit, the way you consistently put the needs of your team ahead of your own recognition. I just try to do good work, I replied, feeling overwhelmed by the public vindication I'd never expected to receive. Good work? Robert Sterling laughed. Michael, you've personally overseen projects worth over $200 million. Your department manages facilities that employ thousands of people and serve millions of guests annually. You've received 3 industry innovation awards and turned down job offers from our biggest competitors. The numbers hung in the air like a challenge to everything Dad had believed about my life. Around us, wedding guests were beginning to whisper among themselves, clearly fascinated by this unexpected drama. Margaret Foster, who had been at the wedding as Robert Sterling's guest, appeared at the edge of our group with a knowing smile. Mr. Sterling, I hope you don't mind the interruption, but I couldn't help overhearing. Michael, I didn't know this was your brother's wedding. Margaret, perfect timing, Robert Sterling said warmly. Margaret Foster, meet the Thompson family. Margaret is our Senior Vice President of Operations and Michael's direct supervisor. Margaret extended her hand to Dad with professional courtesy, but I could see the glint of mischief in her eyes. Mr. Thompson, you must be so proud of Michael. He's absolutely brilliant, one of the most innovative minds in the industry. We're constantly having to turn down headhunters who want to steal him from us. Dad mechanically shook her hand, looking like a man who had just discovered that everything he thought he knew about the world was wrong. In fact, Margaret continued, clearly enjoying the moment, just last month Michael turned down an offer from Hilton International that would have doubled his salary. They wanted him to lead their global sustainability initiative. You turned down a job offer? Derek asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I like where I work, I said simply. And I believe in what we're building at Sterling Industries. Robert. Sterling placed a hand on my shoulder, a gesture that felt both paternal and professional. Michael, I want you to know that your loyalty and dedication haven't gone unnoticed. That's actually why I was planning to call you next week. He turned to address the entire group, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to making announcements that changed people's lives. I'm restructuring our executive team to prepare for our next phase of expansion. Michael, I'm offering you the position of Senior Vice President of Innovation and Strategic Development. The title hit me like a lightning bolt. Senior Vice President was C-suite territory, the kind of position that came with a seat on the executive committee and direct input into company-wide strategic decisions. That's That's an incredible honor, I managed to say. It's not honor, it's recognition, Robert Sterling replied firmly. Recognition of what you've already accomplished and what I know you're capable of achieving in the future. He turned back to Dad, his expression serious but not unkind. Richard, I understand the desire to see our children succeed, but success comes in many forms, and the most valuable contributions often happen behind the scenes. Your son has built something remarkable, and he's done it through innovation, dedication, and genuine care for the people his work affects. Dad opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time in his life, Richard Thompson was completely speechless. The wedding coordinator appeared again, this time with news that the emergency catering had arrived and dinner service was ready to begin. As guests began moving toward the dining area, I found myself standing in a circle that included my family, my CEO, and my supervisor. A convergence of worlds that I had never imagined possible. Michael, Robert Sterling said quietly as the Gao crowd began to disperse. We should talk more about your new role, but I think tonight should be about celebrating your brother's marriage. Congratulations, by the way. You're gaining a wonderful daughter-in-law. Thank you, sir, I replied, still processing everything that had just happened. As Robert Sterling moved away to rejoin his family, Dad remained frozen in place, staring at me as if seeing me for the first time in his life. Michael, he said finally, his voice barely audible. I had no idea. I know, I replied simply. You never asked. The revelation had changed everything, but I realized that the validation I'd been seeking for so many years felt different than I'd expected. It wasn't triumph or vindication I felt. It was a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing that good work, done well, eventually speaks for itself. The boy who had left home as a failure had returned as a success. But more importantly, I had finally learned that my worth wasn't determined by my father's recognition. It was built through years of proving myself to the people who mattered most in my professional life. And now, everyone knows it. The dinner. Service that followed was surreal in ways I couldn't have imagined when I'd reluctantly agreed to attend Derek's wedding. I found myself seated at the family table, directly across from Robert Sterling, who spent much of the meal discussing industry trends and asking my opinion on strategic initiatives as if this were a casual business dinner rather than my brother's wedding reception. Dad sat in stunned silence for most of the first course, mechanically eating his soup while stealing glances at me like I was an exhibit in a museum that he was trying to understand. The transformation in his demeanor was so complete that even other family members began to notice. Richard, you're awfully quiet tonight, commented my Uncle Frank, Dad's older brother who had driven up from Springfield for the wedding. Usually you're holding court with stories about your latest cases. Dad managed a weak smile. Just enjoying the evening, Frank. It's been educational. Derek, meanwhile, seemed caught between amazement and embarrassment. Every few minutes he would look at me and shake his head slightly, as if trying to reconcile the brother he remembered with the successful executive sitting across from him. Mike? He said during a lull in the conversation. I need to apologize. All these years I thought you were just… I didn't understand what you were actually doing. It's okay, Derek. I never really explained it properly. But I should have asked, he insisted. I should have been more interested in your life instead of just assuming. Sarah, who had been listening to our conversation, leaned forward with genuine curiosity. Michael, I have to ask, why didn't you ever mention your position when we were introduced? I spent 20 minutes telling you about my father's business, not realizing you probably knew more about it than I did. It was a fair question and one that I'd been asking myself throughout the evening. Honestly, I've learned that telling people I work for Sterling Industries usually leads to assumptions about how I got the job or what I actually do. It's easier to just say, I'm in facility management and let people draw their own conclusions. Robert Sterling set down his fork and fixed me with a serious look. Michael, that's exactly the kind of humility that makes you so effective as a leader. But it's also why situations like tonight happen. People can't appreciate your accomplishments if they don't know what they are. He turned to address the entire table. I want everyone here to understand something about your son and brother. In an industry where success is usually measured by quarterly profits and stock prices, Michael has consistently focused on innovations that make real people's lives better. His work has improved working conditions for thousands of employees, reduced environmental impact across hundreds of facilities, and set new standards for sustainable business practices. Mom, who had been quietly emotional throughout the meal, finally spoke up. Michael, sweetheart, I had no idea your work was so important. I mean, I knew you were successful, but… You knew? Dad asked, his voice sharper than he probably intended. Mom straightened in her chair, and I saw a flash of the strength that had carried her through years of being married to Richard Thompson. Of course I knew. I'm his mother, Richard. Did you think I wasn't paying attention to his life just because you decided to write him off? The tension at the table ratcheted up several notches. This was clearly a conversation that had been brewing for years. I didn't write him off, Dad protested. I was trying to motivate him to achieve his potential. By telling him he was a disappointment? Mom's voice carried a steel edge I rarely heard. By dismissing his interests as worthless? By cutting off his college funding when he chose a different path than the one you planned for him? Robert Sterling, showing the diplomatic skills that had built his business empire, gently intervened. Perhaps we should focus on celebrating what Michael has accomplished rather than relitigating the past. But Mom wasn't finished. Robert, I appreciate your tact, but this needs to be said. Richard, you spent so many years focused on what you thought success should look like that you completely missed what it actually looked like in your own son. She turned to me, tears in her eyes. Michael, I should have spoken up more. I should have defended you better. I was so afraid of making the family tension worse that I failed to support you the way you deserved. Mom, you did fine, I said softly. You were caught in an impossible situation. No, I wasn't, she replied firmly. I was caught in a situation where I chose to avoid conflict instead of protecting my child. That's on me, not on the circumstances. The honesty of the moment was both uncomfortable and cathartic. Around us, other wedding guests were laughing and celebrating, but our table had become an island of overdue truth-telling. Dad cleared his throat, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. Michael, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. The words hung in the air. In all my years of hoping for this moment, I'd never quite imagined how it would feel when it actually arrived. I was wrong about your career choices, he continued, each word seeming to cost him considerable effort. I was wrong about the value of your work, and I was especially wrong about the way I treated you when you were trying to find your own path. He paused, looking down at his hands. I suppose I was so invested in having two sons follow in my footsteps that I couldn't see the value in a different kind of success. Dad, you don't need to… Yes, I do, he interrupted. Michael, you've accomplished something remarkable, not just professionally, but personally. You built a career and a life based on your own values and interests, despite having no support from the person who should have been your biggest advocate. That takes a kind of strength and integrity that I'm not sure I possessed at your age. Robert Sterling nodded approvingly. Richard, that's very gracious of you. And Michael, I hope you'll accept my perspective as someone who's observed your character in professional settings. Your father is absolutely right about your integrity and strength. Derek, who had been listening to this exchange with growing emotion, suddenly stood up. I need to say something too. The table fell silent as my brother struggled to find his words. Mike, I've been a terrible brother. Not just tonight, but for years. I knew Dad was hard on you, And I told myself it wasn't my problem because I wasn't the target. I convinced myself that you were fine, that you'd figured things out, because it was easier than confronting the fact that our family was treating you unfairly. His voice cracked slightly. When Sarah and I were planning this wedding, I almost didn't invite you. Not because I didn't want you here, but because I was embarrassed about how Dad talks about you. I was worried about what my friends and colleagues, I would think if they met the family failure. Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand supportively. But you're not a failure, Derek continued. You're the most successful person at this table, and more importantly, you're probably the most genuine person I know. You never got caught up in trying to impress people or playing political games. You just focused on doing good work and being a good person. He sat back down, his eyes bright with unshed tears. I want us to be real brothers again, Mike. Not just people who share parents and see each other at holidays. I want to know about your life, your work, your goals. I want to be proud of you, the way I should have been all along. The emotional weight of the moment was almost overwhelming. These were conversations I'd imagined having dozens of times over the years, but the reality was more complex and more healing than any of my mental rehearsals. I'd like that too, I said simply. Robert Sterling, who had been observing this family, reconciliation with the keen interest of someone who valued personal character, leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression. You know, Michael, this evening has reinforced my confidence in promoting you to senior vice president. Leadership isn't just about technical competence or strategic thinking. It's about character under pressure. Watching how you've handled tonight's revelations, how you've responded to your family's emotions with grace and maturity, tells me everything I need to know about the kind of leader you'll be in your expanded role. The promotion offer felt even more significant now, coming at the end of an evening that had fundamentally changed my relationship with my family. Thank you, sir. I'm honored by your confidence, and I'm excited about the opportunities ahead. Speaking of which, Robert Sterling said with a smile, I should probably mention that your new role will involve quite a bit of travel and high-level client interaction. You'll be representing Sterling Industries at industry conferences, leading strategic initiatives with our biggest partners, and possibly appearing in some of our corporate communications materials. He glanced meaningfully at Dad. I hope that won't be a problem for the family. Having a son whose professional achievements receive public recognition can sometimes be overwhelming for parents who aren't used to that level of visibility. Dad actually smiled. A real smile, not the forced expression he'd been wearing all evening. I think I can handle having a successful son, Robert. In fact, I'm looking forward to learning more about what Michael actually does for a living. As the evening wound down and guests began preparing to leave, I found myself exchanging business cards and contact information with people who, hours earlier, had seen me as Richard Thompson's disappointing son. The transformation in how people viewed me was remarkable, but more importantly, the transformation in how my family viewed me felt like the healing of a wound I'd carried for years. Derek and Sarah made plans to visit me in Denver, expressing genuine interest in seeing my work and understanding my life outside the narrow confines of family gatherings. Mom extracted a promise that I would call more often and visit for holidays without needing a wedding as an excuse. Most surprisingly, Dad asked if he could schedule a proper conversation about my career, not to criticize or advise, but to simply understand what I'd built and how I'd built it. I realize I know almost nothing about my own son's professional life, he admitted as we prepared to part ways. I'd like to change that if you're willing. I'd like that too, Dad. As I walked back to my hotel that night, I reflected on how dramatically the evening had exceeded my expectations. I'd come to Derek's wedding dreading another round of family disappointment and judgment. Instead, I'd found validation, reconciliation, and the promise of genuine relationships built on truth rather than assumptions. The boy who had left home 8 years ago as a failure had returned as a success. But more importantly, I'd learned that real success isn't about proving other people wrong. It's about staying true to your own values and building something meaningful with your life. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the people who matter most eventually learn to see that success for what it really is. The family disappointment had become the family success story. But the best part wasn't the vindication. It was the opportunity to finally have the relationships I'd always wanted with the people I'd never stopped loving, despite everything that had happened between us. Some stories end with dramatic confrontations or grand gestures. This one ended with something better. The quiet satisfaction of work well done and family bonds rebuilt on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. And that felt like the best possible ending of all. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.